Hello, Squirrel Squad listeners. We are, whatever the title said we are, in this book, An Old-Fashioned Girl. You pooh, girls. Latin don't amount to much anyway, was the grateful reply. But Polly was used to 'em now, and nothing daunted, took a look at the grimy page in the middle of which Tom had stuck. She read it so well that the young gentleman stopped munching to regard her with respectful astonishment. And when she stopped, he said suspiciously, "You're a sly one, Polly, to study up so you can show off before me, but it won't do, ma'am. Turn over a dozen pages and try again." Polly obeyed and did even better than before, saying as she looked up with a laugh, "I've been through the whole book, so you won't catch me that way, Tom." "I say, how came you to know such a lot?" asked Tom, much impressed. "I studied with Jimmy and kept up with him, for Father let us be together in all our lessons. It was so nice, and we learned so fast." "Tell me about Jimmy. He's your brother, isn't he?" "Yes, but he's dead, you know. I'll tell you about him some other time. You ought to study now, and perhaps I can help you," said Polly, with a little quiver of the lips. "Shouldn't wonder if you could," and Tom spread the book open between them with a grave and businesslike air, for he felt that Polly had got the better of him, and it behooved him to do his best for the honor of his sex. He went at the lesson with a will and soon floundered out of his difficulties, for Polly gave him a lift here and there, and they went on swimmingly, till they came to some rules to be learned. Polly had forgotten them, so they both committed them to memory. Tom, with hands in his pockets, rocked to and fro, muttering rapidly, while Polly twisted the little curl on her forehead and stared at the wall, gabbling with all her might. "Done!" cried Tom presently. "Done!" echoed Polly, and then they heard each other recite till both were perfect. "That's pretty good fun," said Tom, joyfully tossing poor Harkness away and feeling that the pleasant excitement of companionship could lend a charm even to Latin grammar. "Now, ma'am, we'll take a turn at algebra. I like that as much as I hate Latin." Polly accepted the invitation and soon owned that Tom could beat her here. This fact restored his equanimity, but he didn't crow over her, far from it, for he helped her with a paternal patience that made her eyes twinkle with surprised fun, as he soberly explained and illustrated, unconsciously imitated, Domini Dean, till Polly found it difficult to keep from laughing in his face. "You may have another go at it any time you like," generously remarked Tom as he shied the algebra after the Latin reader. "I'll come every evening then. I'd like to, for I haven't studied a bit since I came. You shall try and make me like algebra, and I'll try and make you like Latin, will you?" "Oh, I'd like it well enough if there was anyone explain it to me. Old Dean puts us through double quick and don't give a fella time to ask questions when we read." "Ask your father. He knows." "Don't believe he does. Shouldn't dare to bother him if he did." "Why not? He'd pull my ears and call me a stupid or tell me not to worry him." "I don't think he would. He's very kind to me, and I ask lots of questions." "He likes you better than he does me." "Now, Tom, it's wrong of you to say so. Of course he loves you ever so much more than he does me," cried Polly reprovingly. "Why don't he show it then?" muttered Tom, with a half-wistful, half-defiant glance toward the library door, which stood ajar. "You act so. How can he?" asked Polly, after a pause in which she put Tom's question to herself and could find no better reply than the one she gave him. "Why don't he give me my velocipede?" That old-fashioned bike. He said, if I did well at school for a month, I should have it. And I've been pegging away like fury for most 6 weeks, and he don't do a thing about it. The girls get their duds because they tease. I won't do that anyway, but you don't catch me studying myself to death and no pay for it. It's too bad, but you ought to do it because it's right, and never mind being paid, began Polly, trying to be moral but secretly sympathizing heartily with poor Tom. Don't you preach, Polly. If the governor took any notice of me and cared how I got on, I wouldn't mind the present so much. But he don't care a hang, and never even asked if I did well last declamation day when I'd gone and learned the Battle of Lake Regillus, because he said he liked it. Oh, Tom, did you say that? It's splendid. Jim and I used to say Horatius together, and it was so much fun. Do speak your piece to me. I do so like Macaulay's Lays. I'm sure I should know this stuff, but I don't. It's dreadful long, began Tom, but his face brightened, for Polly's interest soothed his injured feelings, and he was glad to prove his executionary powers. He began without much spirit, but soon the martial ring of the lines fired him, and before he knew it, he was on his legs, thundering away in grand style, while Polly listened with kindling face and absorbed attention. Tom did declaim well, for he quite forgot himself in delivering the stirring ballad with an energy that made Polly flush and tingle with admiration and delight, and quite electrified a second listener who had heard all that went on and watched the little scene from behind his newspaper. His dad. As Tom paused, breathless, and Polly clapped her hands enthusiastically, the sound was loudly echoed from behind him. Both whirled around, and there was Mr. Shaw standing in the doorway, applauding with all his might. Tom looked much abashed and said not a word. Polly ran to Mr. Shaw and danced before him, saying eagerly, "Wasn't it splendid? Didn't he do well? Mayn't he have his velocipede now?" "Capital, Tom. You'll be an orator yet. Learn another piece like that, and I'll come and hear you speak it. Are you ready for your velocipede, hey?" Polly was right, and Tom owned that the governor was kind, did like him, and hadn't entirely forgotten his promise. The boy turned red with pleasure and picked at the buttons on his jacket while listening to this unexpected praise. But when he spoke, he looked straight up in his father's face while his own shone with pleasure, as he answered in one breath, "Thank you, sir. I'll do it, sir. Guess I am, sir." "Very good. Then look out for your new horse tomorrow, sir." And Mr. Shaw stroked the fuzzy red head with a kind hand, feeling a fatherly pleasure in the conviction that there was something in his boy after all. Tom got his velocipede next day, named it Black Oster in memory of the horse in the Battle of Lake Regillus, and came to grief as soon as he began to ride his new steed. "Come out and see me go it," whispered Tom to Polly after 3 days' practice in the street, for he had already learned to ride in the rink. Polly and Maud willingly went and watched his struggles with deep interest till he got an upset which nearly put an end to his velocipeding forever. "Hi there, Ausтер's coming," shouted Tom as he came rattling down the long, steep street outside the park. They stepped aside, and he whizzed by, arms and legs going like mad, with the general appearance of a runaway engine. It would have been a triumphant descent if a big dog had not bounced suddenly through one of the openings and sent the whole concern helter-skelter into the gutter. Polly laughed as she ran to view the ruin, for Tom lay flat on his back with a velocipede atop him, while the big dog barked wildly and his master scolded him for his awkwardness. But when she saw Tom's face, Polly was frightened, for the color had all gone out of it. His eyes looked strange and dizzy, and drops of blood began to trickle from a great cut on his forehead. The man saw it too and had him up in a minute, but he couldn't stand and stared about him in a dazed sort of way as he sat on the curbstone, while Polly held her handkerchief to his forehead and pathetically begged to know if he was killed. "Don't scare, Mother, I'm all right. Got upset, didn't I?" he asked presently, eyeing the prostrate velocipede with more anxiety about its damages than his own. "I knew you'd hurt yourself with that horrid thing. Just let it be and come home, for your head bleeds dreadfully. And everybody's looking at us," whispered Polly, trying to tie the little handkerchief over the ugly cut. "Come on then, Jove, how queer my head feels. Give us a boost, please. Stop howling, Maud, and come home. You bring the machine and I'll pay you, Pat." As he spoke, Tom slowly picked himself up and steadying himself by Polly's shoulder, issued commands, and the procession fell into line. First the big dog barking at intervals, then the good-natured Irishman trundling that divil of a whirligig, as he disrespectfully called the idolized velocipede, then the wounded hero, supported by the helpful Polly, and Maud brought up the rear in tears, bearing Tom's cap. Unfortunately, Mrs. Shaw was out driving with Grandma, and Fanny was making calls, so there was no one but Polly to stand by Tom, for the parlor maid turned faint at the sight of blood, and the chambermaid lost her wits in the flurry. It was a bad cut and must be sewed up at once, the doctor said as soon as he came. "Somebody must hold his head," he added as he threaded his queer little needle. "I'll keep still, but if anybody must hold me, let Polly. You ain't afraid, are you?" asked Tom with an imploring look, for he didn't like the idea of being sewed a bit. Polly was just going to shrink away, saying, "Oh, I can't," when she remembered that Tom once called her a coward. Here was a chance to prove that she wasn't. Besides, poor Tom had no one else to help him. So she came up to the sofa where he lay and nodded reassuringly as she put a soft little hand on either side of the damaged head. "You're a trump, Polly," whispered Tom. Then he set his teeth, clenched his hands, lay quite still, and bore it like a man. It was all over in a minute or two, and when he had had a glass of wine and was nicely settled on his bed, he felt pretty comfortable, in spite of the pain in his head and being ordered to keep quiet. He said, "Thank you ever so much, Polly," and watched her with a grateful face as she crept away. He had to keep the house for a week, and laid about looking very interesting, with a great black patch on his forehead. Everyone petted him, for the doctor said that if the blow had been an inch nearer the temple, it would have been fatal, and the thought of losing him so suddenly made bluff old Tom very precious all at once. His father asked him how he was a dozen times a day. His mother talked continually of that dear boy's narrow escape, and Grandma cockered him up with every delicacy she could invent, and the girls waited on him like devoted slaves. The new treatment had an excellent effect, for when neglected Tom got over his first amazement at this change of base, he blossomed out delightfully, as sick people do sometimes, and surprised his family by being unexpectedly patient, grateful, and amiable. Nobody ever knew how much good it did him, for boys seldom have confidences of this sort except with their mothers, and Mrs. Shaw had never found the key to her son's heart. But a little seed was sowed then that took root, and though it grew very slowly, it came to something in the end. Perhaps Polly helped it a little. Evening was his hardest time, for want of exercise made him as restless and nervous as it was possible for a hardy lad to be on such short notice. He couldn't sleep, so the girls amused him. Fanny played and read aloud. Polly sung and told stories, and did the latter so well that it got to be a regular thing for her to begin as soon as twilight came, and Tom was settled in his favorite place on Grandma's sofa. "Fire away, Polly," said the young sultan one evening, as his little Scheherazade sat down in her low chair after stirring up the fire till the room was bright and cozy. "I don't feel like stories tonight, Tom. I've told all I know and can't make up any more," answered Polly, leaning her head on her hand with a sorrowful look that Tom had never seen before. He watched her a minute and then asked curiously, "What were you thinking about just now when you were staring at the fire and getting soberer and soberer every minute?" I knew this was going to happen. "I was thinking about Jimmy." "Jimmy? Would you mind telling about him? You know you said you would sometime, but don't if you'd rather not," said Tom, lowering his rough voice respectfully. "I like to talk about him, but there isn't much to tell," began Polly, grateful for his interest. "Sitting here with you reminded me of the way I used to sit with him when he was sick. We used to have such happy times, and it's so pleasant to think about them now. He was awfully good, wasn't he?" "No, he wasn't, but he tried to be, and Mother says that's half the battle. We used to get tired of trying, but we kept making resolutions and working hard to keep 'em. I don't think I got on much, but Jimmy did, and everyone loved him. Didn't you ever squabble as we do?" "Yes, indeed, sometimes, but we couldn't stay mad and always made up again as soon as we could. Jimmy used to come round first and say, 'All serene, Polly,' so kind and jolly that I couldn't help laughing and being friends right away." "Did he not know a lot?" "Yes, I think he did, for he liked to study and wanted to get on so he could help Father. People used to call him a fine boy, and I felt so proud to hear it. But they didn't know half how wise he was, because he didn't show off a bit. I suppose sisters always are grand of their brothers, but I don't believe many girls had as much right to be as I had. Most girls don't care two pins about their brothers, so that shows you don't know much about it." "Well, they ought to. If they don't, and they would if the boys were as kind to them as Jimmy was to me." "Why, what did he do?" "Loved me dearly and wasn't ashamed to show it," cried Polly with a sob in her voice that made her answer very eloquent. "What made him die, Polly?" asked Tom soberly after a little pause. "He got hurt coasting last winter, but he never told which boy did it, and he only lived a week. I helped take care of him, and he was so patient. I used to wonder at him, for he was in dreadful pain all the time. He gave me his books and his dog and his speckled hens and his big knife and said, 'Goodbye, Polly,' and kissed me the last thing. And then, oh, Jimmy, if he could only come back." And that's it. No, it's not. Here's a picture. Can you see it? What happened to it? Let's see. Poor Polly's eyes had been getting fuller and fuller, lips trembling more and more as she went on. When she came to that goodbye, she couldn't get any further, but covered up her face and cried as her heart would break. Tom was full of sympathy, but didn't know how to show it, so he sat shaking up the camphor bottle and trying to think of something proper and comfortable to say, when Fanny came to the rescue and cuddled Polly in her arms with soothing little pats and whispers and kisses till the tears stopped, and Polly said she didn't mean to and wouldn't any more. I've been thinking about my dear boy all evening, for Tom reminds me of him, she added with a sigh. Me? How can I, when I ain't a bit like him? Cried Tom, amazed. But you are in some ways. Wish I was, but I can't be, for he was good, you know. So are you when you choose. Hasn't he been good and patient, and don't we all like to pet him when he's clever, Fan? Said Polly, whose heart was still aching for her brother and ready for his sake to find virtues even in tormenting Tom. Yes, I don't know the boy lately, but he'll be as bad as ever when he's well, returned Fanny, who hadn't much faith in sick bed repentances. Much you know about it, growled Tom, lying down again, for he had sat bolt upright when Polly made the astounding declaration that he was like the well-beloved Jimmy. That simple little history had made a deep impression on Tom, and the tearful ending touched the tender spot that most boys hide so carefully. It's very pleasant to be loved and admired, very sweet to think we shall be missed and mourned when we die, and Tom was seized with a sudden desire to imitate this boy, who hadn't done anything wonderful, yet was so dear to his sister, that she cried for him a whole year after he died. So studious and clever. The people called him a fine fellow, and so anxious to be good that he kept on trying till he was better even than Polly, whom Tom privately considered a model of virtue as girls go. I wish I had a sister like you, he broke out all of a sudden. And I just wish I had a brother like Jim, cried Fanny, for she felt the reproach in Tom's words and knew she deserved it. I shouldn't think you'd envy anybody, for you've got one another, said Polly, with such a wistful look that it suddenly set Tom and Fanny to wondering why they didn't have better times together and enjoy themselves, as Polly and Jim did. Fan don't care for anybody but herself, said Tom. Tom is such a bear, retorted Fanny. I wouldn't say such things, for if anything should happen to either of you, the other would feel so sorry. Every cross word I ever said to Jimmy comes back now and makes me wish I hadn't. 2 great tears rolled down Polly's cheeks and were quietly wiped away, but I think they watered that sweet sentiment, called fraternal love, which till now had been neglected in the hearts of this brother and sister. They didn't say anything then, or make any plans, or confess any faults, but when they parted for the night, Fanny gave the wounded head a gentle pat. Tom never would have forgiven her if she had kissed him, and said in a whisper, I hope you'll have a good sleep, Tommy dear. And Tom nodded back at her with a hearty, same to you, Fan. That was all. But it meant a good deal, for the voices were kind and the eyes met full of that affection which makes words of little consequence. Polly saw it, and though she didn't know that she had made the sunshine, it shone back upon her so pleasantly that she fell happily asleep, though her Jimmy wasn't there to say good night. And now that's all of chapter 3. 4. Chapter 5 we'll get into tomorrow is called Scrapes. S-C-R-A-P-E-S. It's getting good. Alrighty then. I hope you have a great evening. Saturday evening. I'm going to try to get into something. That's Anita. Bless her heart, she gave me $20 PayPal funds. I've been chomping at the bit like I need to. I did need to get out of the house. When you're poor, you ain't got no... I mean, the only place I go when I go out is to the post office, to the mailbox here at the house, or yarn shopping or looking. So, that $20, I got 3 bags full of stuff at the die lot sale. And I'll show y'all either tomorrow or Monday. And I have some squealing squirrel mail too. So I may come back with that. I guess I will. Alright, y'all be sweet. Don't be ugly. Love y'all. Bye-bye.